Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a brand new series that I'm hoping to bring to you each and every week, at least one episode. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Backpack Off the Trail, Part 1. Let's get straight into that. Have you ever found yourself in a dark and scary environment, and where everything around you is screaming for you to leave, and where the shadows that linger in your peripheral seem to move only for them to disappear the second you turn to look? Well, I have. And let me tell you, sometimes it's better off they disappear, because trust me when I say this, when they don't, and your worst fear is confirmed as they stand there looming over you, there is nothing more terrifying. It's at that point you should disappear, and it's at that point I believe so many have done just that and disappeared, but not through their own escape. No, through whoever or whatever is hot on their heels, hungry for satisfaction and flesh, stealing those unfortunate few away in the night, never to be seen again. Many cases of unsolved disappearances in swamps and national forests are clustered into a couple of circumstances. Those being that the missing have in fact fallen victim to the elements, or the missing has fallen down a crevice or fissure, and with rescuers unable to search those locations. Well, finally, the factor of predator or human interference is of course a big possibility in some national parks and swamps, although in my opinion these happen very rarely. All of course are just speculation from a researcher's perspective, as obviously without the bodies of the missing we have no real idea what happened to them. At least that's the case with thousands who go missing each year. I suppose some of these folks simply wanted to go missing for multiple reasons, but that's a whole different story altogether. Now, late last summer, however, myself, my wife and a few friends would find ourselves nearly becoming a statistic and uncovering the truth behind 5 other people's disappearances. Now, I believe I have an idea of what's happening all over the world in the wild, untouched regions of our planet. I know why people are going missing in our swamps and national forests, and here is our story. My name is Michael. I'm 35. My wife Kathy is 38, along with our friends Dave, 42, Jim, 45, Stacy, 40, Louise, 41, and Danny, 43. And we decided to take a vacation to Bond Swamp in Macon, Georgia. We planned to take Danny and Jim's ATVs from a southeastern trailhead and drive down into a deep hollow that had an old disused logging road attached to it 2 or 3 miles in. And from there, we would have to climb our way another 6 miles deeper into the swamp, find a suitable spot for beers, base camp and fishing, and enjoy ourselves for a week, or maybe more, depending on the weather and what we found. In the end, we only lasted 5 nights, but in all the truth, that felt like months in that dark and unforgiving place. Now, the Friday we left started out like any other weekend. We met up at the local rest stop just outside of town at around 4:30 a.m. And from there we left in 2 vehicles to the trailhead, in high spirits and eager to get hiking into the thick swampy wilderness. That morning seemed to fly by as the surrounding landscape changed more and more, as fields gave way to large hills and deep hollows. The sun rose high into the sky, casting long rays of shimmering sunlight up and out as it did so. A canvas washed with beautiful oranges and purples, eventually breaking onto the pristine sky blue above. As the hours went by, the open lands gave way to thick swamps, and then all we could see were dank, dense forests of cypress trees for miles around. As we reached our location, it was a little after 2 p.m. A little later than anticipated, but we were all experienced outdoorsmen. Outdoorswoman. Whatever. We were all very prepared for a week or more in the swamp. The most we expected to happen was myself and Danny drinking too much beer and then falling into the water. "Everybody set?" I asked, as Kathy, my wife, nodded. "Yeah," said Jim. "Almost," hollered Danny and Stacy. "All set," added Louise and Dave. "Great. Let's have a look at the map just quickly and see where we are to the best fishing spots," I responded with a spring in my step. We planned on roughly heading in a straight direction for around 3 miles, and then we would disembark from the ATVs and take a right and head on further into the swamp's most untouched regions. A lot of low-lying land, so it would no doubt be flooded out at this time of year. But if our map skills were as good as we thought they were, we could snake along a levee and some higher ridges that run to the west, which would continue for hundreds of miles until eventually up and out of the swampy terrain and more of a dense pine forest topography. Now, the location we wanted to get to had been rumoured to have some of the best fishing around. Apparently, Dave had spoken to a couple of the old-timers in town, and they told him it was a cursed place. It had some of the biggest gar they'd ever seen, and catfish as long as your boat. Now, Dave listened to their tale and brushed away their warnings, and said he'd been to all the so-called haunted spots all over the United States, but in truth, I had known Dave all of my life, and the furthest he had been outside of our little town was Macon, Georgia. He attended one ghost investigation at a local courthouse, and bam, Dave was an expert paranormal investigator. "There's a booger in that holler," he barked at myself, Kathy and Danny the week before we decided to get everyone together. "Sure, buddy. A vampire, a rougarou, and a booger," I sarcastically added as he rolled his eyes at me whilst rolling a joint. Whatever, man. You guys haven't seen what I've seen, been where I've been," he barked back at us all as we chuckled to ourselves. "So, you actually believe what the old-timers say about that there holler?" asked Kathy while she passed me the joint, a long stream of grey smoke pluming up to the ceiling of my truck. "Ha ha ha ha!" cried Danny, out loud as his eyes glowed a shady-looking red, Cheeto crumbs all down his chin and top. We all joined in with his giggle fit as Dave shook his head, eventually succumbing to the laughing himself, whilst insisting, "It's true, guys, it's true." With the weather good, we set out on our ATVs and began a journey into the hot and lush swampland. The vegetation was so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet either side of the narrow trail, but we were making good time, and after an hour or so we found the end of the trail and could no longer travel on the ATVs. As we switched off the engines, I stopped and listened. For what, I'm not sure, but all I could hear was the almighty crescendo of nature. Insects and birds chirped and squawked their own symphony as the hot and humid air around us rushed through the canopy and surrounding flora. Long strands of cypress trees dangled and swayed in a heavy breeze, and across from us, some 35 yards on a muddy bank of water, a group of alligators basked in the sun, their huge sharp mouths open, soaking up the late afternoon sunlight. A couple scattering and taking to the water to come and take a closer look at us. With everything set and ready, we set course and began hiking through the swamp. The going was extremely tough, and I just thank God we all had some sort of fitness level. With the crippling heat and clammy humidity and unforgiving swampland, it's no easy task going off trail into a swamp. Especially when there are things in that swamp that want to eat you or fuck you up before they move on, seemingly waiting around every other corner. But despite the extremities, we trekked on further and further away from civilization and deeper into the nature's playground. It seemed like the further we hiked into that cursed place, the more the feeling of anxiety was building in my gut, swirling around and over like some mystical warning from another plane, screaming at me to stop, turn around and go back home, back away from this land and the secrets of which it holds. Alas, I didn't. I chose to ignore those horrid gut-wrenching feelings of doom and despair. Maybe if I had listened, things might have been different. Who cares? What's done is done now. I shall have to live with it for the rest of my damned life. As the afternoon waned and the early evening was drawing near, the wind had picked up some, and the treetops rustled and swayed heavily in the breeze, every now and then creeping and groaning as their enormous weight shifted. The further we hiked in, the quieter the insects and birds seemed to be. It was like we were becoming the only living beings inside that part of the swamp. Only our light chatter and footfalls could be heard. Danny noticed it too and made a remark about predators and being cautious not to spook a critter. But with a feeling building in my own gut, I knew it was something else, something ancient and primal was at play. We passed a couple of great spots for fishing and a base camp, but chose to go on further and deeper into the swamp, and eventually, with about an hour of sunlight left, we stopped at a perfect clearing. At a clearing, it was strange to say the least, as if almost suddenly it was a perfect circle, with 4 small game trails connecting to it, one of which led to a lovely pond, which Jim and I were sure would hold the infamous giant gar and giant catfish. We set up camp and a couple of the guys went to collect firewood. As I was returning to camp with an armful of logs and sticks, my chest, I felt tight. I noticed I was struggling to breathe and catch my breath, so I stopped on the barely visible trail and sat at the base of a large cypress tree. I drank some of my water and tried to compose myself, but I just couldn't seem to get my breath back. The heavy, humid atmosphere seemed oppressive, and almost like it was strangling me as sweat beaded on my brow, dropping to the dusty ground at my feet. For a second, I thought I was having a panic attack. Although I'd never had one before, I had seen my mother suffer with them for many years. As I sat there gasping and trying to compose myself, I noticed, just off from the oblivious trail I had just been following back to camp, some 10 feet in front of me, in a gathering of hogweed and brush, a backpack. A green and black with yellow trim backpack. I got to my hands and knees slowly and rose to my feet, looking around for anyone that might have possibly owned the backpack, that may have stashed it to take a leak or something. But I found no one. There was nobody out here this far into the swamp. We had encountered no one on our entire trip into the camp, and there wasn't a designated camp or trails for hundreds of miles. I reached in slowly at first, cautious of the fact that I was in a living, breathing swamp and everything inside of it either stung or bit you. We would have no hope of treatment or evacuation by a medical rescue team should things go south. No pun intended. If one of us got bitten by a cottonmouth or injured ourselves badly, with no one around, we would have to pull together and carry the bitten or injured out to a more reachable locale. Anyway, as I was saying, I slowly reached into the brush and yanked the backpack out and free from its hiding place, grateful to see there were no creepy crawlies attached or rushing out at my feet. Now the bag was heavy, much heavier than I had expected, and seemed fairly old. On closer inspection, it most certainly was old. I had been in that location for God knows how many years. The salt and minerals in the earth had marked the material with white marks, and there was a green mould or algae from the dank, humid environment and time starting to cover the expanse of the material. As I was inspecting the backpack further for a name, there was a sudden loud snap from my rear and off to the left. I turned, half expecting it to be one of my friends or Kathy pulling a prank on me. Instead, I was met with silence, and a chill crept its way up my spine. Only the warm breeze making its way through the sticks and leaves was all I could hear. Hello? I called, but was met with more silence. Once again, I checked the backpack, making sure it was bug-free, and then I shrugged my shoulders and swung it onto my back, then grabbed up the pile of wood and headed back to camp once again. As I did so, I could have sworn I heard something pacing me, step for step, off to my right. But when I stopped and turned, nothing was there, or I just couldn't see it. Thoroughly creeped out and a little bewildered, I made it back to camp unscathed. Kathy instantly gave me a look of puzzlement as I walked into camp, smiling to her as I chucked the pile of kindling and logs that I collected down at the side of our fire pit. "What?" I asked her. "Really? That's all you got to say?" she said with an irritated irk in her tone. "Okay," I countered. "Mike, you've been gone for over 3 hours. Where the hell have you been? I was worried." She scolded me with a fiery fury, the others now turning and all breathing an audible sigh of relief. "What? No way, Kath. I've literally been half an hour tops," I added. Kathy looked to Stacy, then to Jim and Danny. "Well, she's right, bro. You've been gone for hours now. We were one step away from sending out a search party for you," added Jim, who wore a look of pure annoyance, puzzlement, all in one face. "Okay, guys, good one. But really, I've only been gone for 30 minutes, not more than a quarter mile at most," I said as I placed the backpack to one side and sat at the fire pit with Kathy and Danny. Now Stacy was opposite us with Dave, and she just shook her head. "Mike, it's almost 10 p.m. Look," said Dave as he glared at me with his watch. And sure enough, it read 10:08 p.m. "What the?" I trailed off in bewilderment. "Well, that's strange, but look what I found just off one of the trails," I added as I swung the backpack in front of my legs. Everyone turned their attention to the pack as it sat there, as the glow of the fire danced across it and shadows moved against the trees on the outer edge of our firelight. "Wow, that looks old as shit," remarked Danny as Jim came to take a closer look. As we turned the backpack around in the firelight, I spotted an old faded name tag hanging near one of the zips of the main compartment. It seemed to read R. Campbell or R. Cambert, but it was heavily damaged and faded from years of exposure to the elements. "I wonder who it belongs to," Stacy said, with a look of worry on her face. "Well, whoever it was, they surely have since moved on," Jim remarked as he opened one of the compartments and pulled out a paper. "The paper's dated 21st of September, 1994, he added as he held up a brown, weathered newspaper. "Wow, let me take a look at that," said Stacy as she reached over, swapping a joint for the paper. Danny and I both raising our eyebrows at the strange find. Jim continued to empty the compartment of random items you would expect to take whilst hiking. Some gloves, a hat, and a change of clothes. There was also some loose paperwork that looked to be photocopies of documents, but we'll get to those. And right at the bottom of the compartment was a lock knife and a small medkit. As we sat there, each passing the paperwork around to study it, the feeling of dread and danger returned tenfold. From where I sat, I could see I was not the only one feeling this way. Opposite of me, Danny looked around cautiously, as not to freak out Stacy, his wife, who sat quietly sipping a beer and reading through the documents one by one. Now, from my first glance at the documents, I knew something was wrong. At least 3 out of 20-odd documents were the local town census for births, deaths, and marriages between the years of 1940 and 1990. There were a few scribbled notes here and there against certain names. And clearly, someone was trying to connect a few dots for whatever reason. I remember like yesterday reading one such note. It was repeated throughout the documents and simply said, "Purebred." At the time, I remember a shiver chasing my soul up my spine as I read that haunting word. And other such notes were Rogue W, S Walker, and Shadow W, and finally Contained and Contain. At first, this left a lot of us baffled to say the least, but it was Stacy who put some of the pieces together. She saw the pattern that the rest of us were not. Whoever had owned this backpack was looking for something or someone, and they had gone to great lengths to research the local history in an age before the internet was even a common thing. At best a few articles online, but the options were limited in those days. If you wanted some information, you grabbed your library card and off you went. More to the point of her conclusions was the haunting article on the 4th page of the newspaper. Nothing huge, but on the left-hand margin there was a small article with pictures adjacent. I had read as follows. Third hunter missing in Bond Swamp, Georgia. Authorities are drawn to a new conclusion in the search for 3 men lost to the wilderness of Bond Swamp. Possible predator involvement could point to the disappearances of 2 hunters and 1 hiker. Game wardens have stated that they are doing all they can to bring the missing men home, but hopes are being dashed aside as more and more new evidence is being found. What we know so far is that the 3 men, 2 hunters and a hiker, are not known to each other, have no real enemies to speak of, and hold no outstanding debts. All 3 vehicles registered to each of the men have been located at 3 different locations in a 10-mile radius of each other. Well, given this information, authorities are certain that the men should be within this area and have dogs and trackers, as well as many local people searching every hollow and every creek. Helicopters have been in the sky too for a week now, since the first alarm was raised for the young Mr. Barnes. But hopes are falling as torn clothing has been found 6 miles from his truck's location outside of the swamp. Authorities haven't confirmed if it is Mr. Barnes' clothing, but can confirm that the material recovered is of a black and green with possible yellow trim. Forensics are running tests as we speak and should have a better idea by tomorrow morning. After today's worrying news of a 3rd man not returning home as planned, Sheriff Penton had this to say. Good morning, folks. I realize a lot of you have important questions, and I'll do my best to get through as many as I can, given the time I have. As some of you are aware, this morning, a Mr. Johnny Lennon was reported to my offices as missing. Johnny, unfortunately, is now part of Operation Crystal, with the likes of Mr. Granger and Mr. Solomon. We believe these men are connected in some form or fashion. We now believe that somebody or something has caused these men to not come home as planned with their families, and possibly even caused these men harm. The evidence we have received from various sites in and around the search area suggests there was a struggle and possibly something further malevolent in intention. Our forensics team are running on the necessary tests on said items. I'll be holding a more in-depth press conference tomorrow morning when I have more solid information to give you. We pray for these young men's lives and safe return home to their families. And that's all for now, folks. Thanks for your time. And the article went on to pretty much summarize what Sheriff Penton had said. And there was 3 pictures of the missing men adjacent. All were young men in the prime of their lives. Also, the sheriff mentioned that the material recovered was of a black, green, and yellow trim. That matched the backpack we had found, but I had seen there were no tears or missing bits of material. It would make sense that a hiker had a matching jacket to his backpack, as they are often sold as such for the trendy city folk who care how they look in the middle of nowhere. As we sat there drinking and smoking, my mind, and I'm guessing everyone else's too, was beginning to put the pieces together slowly. As the night turned to the early hours, and we all had our fair share of strawberry kush and beer, we decided to turn in for the night. The fire was down to glowing embers, and there was a cool breeze moving through camp, and we each settled into our sleeping bags, donning mosquito nets as we did so. Around 2:45 in the morning, I was awoken by a nudge on my shoulder. Half asleep and confused, I opened my eyes and looked around. Nothing seemed to be out of place, and so I thought I had imagined it. Kathy was sound asleep, and I listened. I could hear Danny's heavy snoring going on and on. I rolled my eyes and went to turn over, and that's when it happened. From my side of the tent, a large figure pressed its face against the tent wall. As it tried to do so again, I jumped back, clutching my sleeping bag to my chin, my legs drawn up under me and my body tangled in a mosquito net all at the same time, an instant panic rushing through my body. Kathy was positioned behind me, still oblivious to the thing's presence. It then snorted a deep and powerful snort, like a prize bull might make before it charged. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream or make a sound. I was glued to the spot, watching this enormous shape of something's head retract from the thin fabric between I and it. And then there was a hand. I swear to God, it was a hand that seemed to sweep its long fingertips along the wall of the tent, making a strange swishing sound as it did so. I could smell its pungent breath, and it seemed to reek of blood and death. Again, it pushed its head into my tent wall, stretching the fabric to the point of nearly tearing. And of course, I thought, oh shit, bear! However, this time, it placed both hands on top of the tent's apex, where its face stretching the tent and bending the frame until it was mere inches away from my face. Sweat poured off of me, and I must have smelled like dinner to this creature. I had lingered for a few minutes, just right there in front of me. I could hear its cavernous breaths heaving in oxygen in and out. Every now and then it made a guttural gurgling or moan that made my chest rattle like a xylophone. And still, I stayed my course of silence and zero movement, fixated with what I was sure was certain death in the most gruesome manner imaginable. Saliva had begun to drip and drop every now and then down from its maw and onto the canvas of the tent, making these sploosh sounds. I could tell that this thing was hungry, and whatever it was thinking meant agony for me. As if by sheer luck or pure coincidence, Danny made a growl of his own as I guess he turned in his sleep. The wall of my tent instantly sprang back, albeit more loosely than before, as the enormous creature turned its attention to Danny's tent. As quick as relief came, it was washed away instantly with fear and panic, as again my heart raced. If Danny's out cold, and that beast is going to get him. I thought to myself as sweat again poured off my brow. My mind exploded with ideas, but none of which would be useful. What the hell was I to do? Reaching for my Glock 20 10mm 220 grain buffalo bore sidearm, I crept on my hands and knees slowly towards the entrance of my tent. I can remember thinking to myself, what the hell are you doing, man? But creep I did, as my heart was in my throat. At this point, I prayed that Kathy wouldn't wake up, as the wind had picked up as I made it to the zipper on the tent flap. And with the wind picking up, the embers of the fire flickered brighter, illuminating the camp slightly. And then, through the thin tent canvas, I could slightly see this enormous creature, albeit an indescribable, blurry shape, but I could make out its stature and shape. And what I saw sent cold chills through my nervous system. Like all my ancestral knowledge and blood was screaming to me that this was something not many see, but those that do hardly ever live to tell the tale. to my disbelief, he was on 2 feet, 7 or 8 feet tall. His shoulders easily 4 feet across, and it had long arms. Well, I mean really long. The beast's arms hung right down to its calves. But as scared as I was in that tiny false security of my tent, I was then more concerned with my good friend Danny. At least if I stopped it striking him first, we might stand a chance. But I couldn't be too hasty about this. I wouldn't want to provoke whatever this creature was. It was clearly large and, no doubt, very powerful. I had to play it cool and be ready for anything. And so I paused by the zipper and listened. And Danny still continued his serenade of snoring and talking in his sleep. There, I heard a heavy thump thump thump, and the dry leaf matter and twig snapping from just outside Danny's tent and off to my right. I held my breath and made sure the safety was off for my firearm. The dense thumps of the creature's footfall appeared to start circling our camp. Every now and then it would snort to make that deep, wet gurgling sound. I could have sworn that now and then it would produce this snickering or chuckling which caused me to gape my mouth in terror. Time seemed to stop as I sat there listening and waiting for anything to happen. The hours flew past, and before I knew it, it was 5:30 a.m. The strangest and scariest thing is, I never heard it leave. It seemed to circle our camp over and over, and then the sun came up and I worked up the courage to look outside. Plus, I was busting for a leak after all that beer the night before. Slowly and cautiously, I unzipped the zipper and held my breath, preparing myself for a showdown. And slowly, I peeked outside the tent. There was a thick blanket of mist drifting its way through camp. The swamp was still deathly quiet. Not a critter, insect, bird or ginormous man-eating beast anywhere to be seen. I climbed out of the tent and took a look around me, 360. All around my tent and throughout camp, there was deep footprints in the ground. As I had expected, in all honesty. Part of me was glad they were there. It meant I wasn't losing my mind, whilst the other half just wanted to run back to the ATVs and get the hell out of there. I made my way to the fire pit and set about relighting the fire, using some kindling and some of the old still glowing embers. Next, I went to wake up the others. The heavy, low-hanging mist swirled and swooshed around as I walked through camp to each tent, and soon everyone was awake and gathered at the fire pit, sipping hot coffee and nursing our foggy, hungover heads. The others hadn't noticed the prints yet, and I was a little surprised, as it wasn't as if they were subtle. I didn't know where to begin, and so I sat for a while and just listened and watched the tree line surrounding us for any movement. I'm sure Jim and Danny picked up on my odd behaviour, as I caught each one of them with a longing gaze in my direction. And so I brushed aside my concern of everyone laughing at me and came right out with it. After all, it was a danger to all of our well-being, be it supernatural or just my imagination. Guys, I said softly at first, then cleared my throat and tried for their attention once more. Guys, listen to me for a second. Please don't freak out, and also, don't laugh at me. Stacy and Dave turned to me, and so did the others, holding their conversations. What's the matter, Michael? Asked Dave as he sipped the last of his strong black coffee before setting it down on a tree stump he positioned next to him the night before. Yeah, what's the matter, mate? You look like shit, and as if you've been up all night, added Jim whilst Danny nodded with a grin. Oh, thanks, I guess, I said before getting to my point. Look, I was up all night. You guys, look around you. Have you not noticed the prints? Look, I said with more gusto than was necessary, pointing to the prints nearest to my seat. When we all went to sleep last night, I was awoken by something at like 3 a.m. I'm not kidding either. At first I thought it was you guys just playing a prank on me, But as I sat there, rubbing my eyes and I went to turn over, it did it again, and this time. I trailed off for a second, shaken as I recounted what had taken place only hours before. "What the hell, bro? You feeling okay?" asked Jim as Kathy looked at me perplexed. Yeah, I'm feeling fine, brother. It's just we need to get out of here," I added, struggling to find the words I needed at that moment. But by now, everyone had stayed very quiet as they looked around the camp area at the enormous prints. Then they returned to look back at me, a look of worry mixed with puzzlement written on each of their faces. "Wait, so you're saying some beast or man walked into our camp last night?" asked Stacy with a worried expression drawn across her face. "Ha!" scoffed Louise while shooting me an eye roll. We never did get on, and she always seemed to be too smart for her own good and would often cause a scene no matter what. Yep, little miss, I need attention. As for Dave, well, he always seemed to kiss up to Danny and Jim, and to be frank, we only hung out together because of our connection to Danny and Jim. He knew full well how much I and Louise didn't get along, and so he chose to always stoke the angst and bad vibes between the both of us, and then play the big macho man coming to the rescue of his damsel in distress. Anyway, sorry, I got off track there for a minute, didn't I? I continued. "Look, guys, whatever this creature was, it was absolutely huge, and the weirdest thing was that it stood on 2 legs, like a man, but much bigger. This creature walked around our camp as all of you slept. The nudging had woke me. It was its face and snout as it pushed against the tent wall. Hell, I saw it had hands and claws on its fingers. I don't know what it was, as when I went to look outside, it was gone. At least, that's what I hope." I finished with some of the other details I'd mentioned above, as each of my friends and the girls listened intently. I noticed that halfway through my speech that Danny and Jim had gotten up to start inspecting the prints further. "These look human almost," called Jim from about 20 yards. "Yeah, but look here. That's claw indentations. You see?" said Danny as he pointed to another set of 12 prints, following with his hand as he walked Jim along them. "Bear?" asked Danny to Jim. Jim looked up at me and Danny with a pale face. His skin had become instantly ashen, which for Jim was strange because he was a good roofer and spent half the year sun-kissed golden. Now, as he walked back to the fire pit and sat at his spot, his face looked aged, almost. I've seen this before," Jim said as he trailed off for a moment. "My grandpappy would tell us stories of skinwalkers and shadow walkers that would trick and play with their targets before eventually killing them. Then, one winter myself and 4 cousins took a fishing trip to Ohio, and we seen these tracks there. The next thing we know, we walked into a darn bloodbath. I swear, there was entrails and heads laying all over the place. I counted 6 heads total before my head started spinning and my stomach heaved. We turned tail as something large was heading in our direction from deeper in the brush. I managed to glance over my shoulder as we ran for the trucks, and what I saw has stuck with me forever. I see this giant of a man on all 4s crashing through small trees and brush, but this man, he wasn't right. He looked like a darn werewolf. He had huge long arms that were covered in hair as dark as night itself, a pair of long, pointy black ears like a Doberman Pinscher, and those eyes. Oh God, his eyes glowed a fiery blood red. He had a wicked smile plastered across his face as I turned tail, and I didn't look back until we made it back to the trucks. As we all jumped in and Jerry cranked the Bronco's engine, the Wolfman burst through the tree line, saliva drooling from its maw and dust kicking up as he slid in the gravel dirt. We left him in our dust as he howled a long, mournful howl, and that to this day still sends shivers down my spine. As Jim finished his story of his own experience, the others and I were left in shock. That impending feeling of dread burst into my chest as I placed the pieces of puzzle that Jim had provided with what I had already experienced a few hours before. We were deep in Wolfman's territory, and only myself, Jim, and possibly Danny and Stacy seemed to realize quite how dangerous the situation was. As for Dave and Louise, they were already getting on my tits, and so yeah, a perfect storm in a teacup. Wow. Hopefully another one. Wow. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. For myself, just randomly, spontaneously went with the ebb and flow, as Michael G. Lockhart would say. The ebb and flow of an idea and just ran with it. Got lots more planned for this series. Going to incorporate lots of split dimensions and some shadow walkers and vampires, skinwalkers, and some paranormal demonic sort of aspect as well. A little bit of everything, sort of throw it in a pot and mix it about and see what we get. Of course, as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Of course, if you want to go by your own ebb and flow and have a crack at writing, or possibly already are a writer and just looking to find a platform to display your wonderful work, please do get in contact with myself at the usual email address, which is DMTForestOfFEAR@gmail.com. As ever, guys, I hope you're all well and happy, keeping fit and focused and busy as possible. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.